They did not know it then, but on the night of August 9th, 1942, in the black waters northwest of Guadalcanal, the United States Navy sailed straight into the jaws of a weapon that no American officer believed could exist. The cruisers of the Allied screening force moved through Ironbottom Sound in what should have been a position of overwhelming strength. 8 heavy and light cruisers, destroyers on the flanks, in radar watch teams scanning for any sign of Japanese movement. Yet when the Japanese 8th Fleet under Admiral Gunichi Mikawa swept down from the north, they carried with them a secret so powerful it changed the balance of naval warfare. The Type 93 Long Lance, a 610mm torpedo with a range, speed, and explosive force beyond anything the Americans imagined. The battle began not with gunfire, but with shadows. Japanese lookouts spotted the Allied ships first, a result of superior night optics and years of night fighting tradition. Mikawa's cruisers maneuvered silently into position, closing to what American tacticians believed was far outside torpedo range. What followed was a moment so swift and devastating that survivors struggled to believe it had happened. At 01:38, Japanese cruisers Chokai, Oba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutaka unleashed spreads of Type 93s, torpedoes that traveled more than 10 miles at high speed and left almost no visible trail. The Allied task force never saw them coming. The first explosions tore through USS Canberra and HMS Canberra. Then USS Chicago staggered under a hit, and within minutes, USS Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were burning and sinking. 4 cruisers lost or doomed in less than an hour, the worst defeat in U.S. naval history. And still, no one on the American side understood what had struck them. Officers guessed submarine ambush, magazine detonation, or Japanese mines. No one considered a torpedo attack because American doctrine insisted that no torpedo in the world could hit from such a distance. The U.S. Navy believed the effective range of ship-launched torpedoes was roughly 5,000 to 8,000 yards. The Long Lance could exceed 20,000. American sailors trying to comprehend the battle recalled that they never saw a wake, never saw a periscope, never saw anything at all. The water simply erupted beneath their ships. That was the genius and terror of the Type 93. Fueled by pure compressed oxygen instead of air, it produced almost no exhaust trail. Its warhead was more than 1,000 pounds of explosive, nearly double the size of U.S. Mark 15 warheads, and it ran fast, up to 49 knots, without sacrificing range. In 1942, there was nothing like it in the world. But the Americans did not yet know this. After Savo Island, they blamed poor lookout discipline, slow reaction times, or the shock of encountering a skilled night-fighting navy. They did not realize they had been hit by torpedoes fired from beyond the horizon of their expectations. The same pattern repeated months later at Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942. U.S. cruisers under Rear Admiral Carleton Wright unleashed radar-directed gunfire on a small Japanese destroyer force attempting to resupply Guadalcanal. The Americans believed they had achieved surprise. They believed they were winning. And in terms of gunnery, they were. Japanese destroyers like Takanami, Kuroshio, Oyashio, and Naganami suffered heavily. But before they withdrew, the Japanese fired spreads of Type 93s that caught the American cruisers in a deadly crossfire. The results were catastrophic. USS Northampton took 2 torpedoes and sank. USS Minneapolis lost her bow. USS New Orleans lost 40 feet of her forward hull in a single blast. USS Pensacola burned fiercely after a hit near the engine room. 4 cruisers crippled in minutes, again by a weapon the Americans neither fully understood nor respected. Sailors described seeing explosions with no warning, no wake, and no idea where the attack originated. Some believed Japanese destroyers had closed to point-blank range. Others swore they had been hit by mines. Few imagined that the Japanese had simply fired at extreme distance and let physics, and American ignorance, do the rest. By the end of 1942, the U.S. Navy had suffered more torpedo damage in surface combat than any major navy since World War I, and yet the root cause remained hidden behind a wall of assumptions. American leaders continued to believe Japanese torpedoes were roughly equivalent to their own. They continued to assume long-range night attacks were impractical. They continued to underestimate the skill of Japanese torpedo officers. The truth was harsher. The Japanese had mastered a style of night surface warfare that the Americans were unprepared for, using a weapon the Americans had never trained to fight. The shock of Savo Island and Tassafaronga was not simply defeat, it was revelation. A revelation that something terrifying and unknown was stalking American ships in the dark, striking from distances they had been taught were impossible. Only later would they learn the name of the weapon that haunted them, the long lance.
In the months following Savo Island, American officers struggled to explain how a supposedly inferior navy had struck with such speed, precision, and overwhelming lethality. The answer was not a single failure, but a system of vulnerabilities, technological, doctrinal, and tactical, that left U.S. surface forces exposed to Japan's mastery of night warfare. At the core of this weakness was radar. In mid-1942, most American cruisers and destroyers carried SC or SC-1 air search radar, equipment designed to detect aircraft, not surface ships. These sets lacked the resolution to pick Japanese ships out of sea clutter and often failed to provide reliable bearing data at night. While a few ships carried the newer SG surface search radar, it had not yet been widely deployed, and many captains still trusted their lookouts more than their unfamiliar electronic instruments. Japanese ships, meanwhile, relied on extraordinary visual training. Their lookouts, arguably the best in the world, could detect enemy silhouettes at ranges where American crews saw only black horizon. This meant the Imperial Navy almost always made visual contact first, maneuvered first, and fired first. The second American disadvantage lay in training. Before the war, the U.S. Navy believed night engagements would be chaotic, largely ineffective affairs. As a result, night fighting doctrine emphasized caution, maintain formation, avoid confusion, limit aggressive maneuvers, and refrain from firing unless targets were confirmed. The Japanese, by contrast, treated night as their primary battlefield. They held large-scale live-fire night exercises using coordinated destroyer and cruiser formations. They trained officers to read patterns in moonlit water and taught lookouts to detect wakes, smoke, and silhouettes with uncanny accuracy. Japanese destroyers practiced mass torpedo attacks under simulated battle conditions, launching full spreads in darkness to perfect timing and coordination. When war began, they were executing methods the Americans barely understood. Torpedo quality further widened the gap. The U.S. Navy entered the war with the Mk-15 torpedo, theoretically capable but plagued by severe flaws. It often ran too deep, its magnetic exploder frequently malfunctioned, and its contact exploder failed at certain angles of impact. Many Mk-15s simply did not detonate or veered off course. Some American destroyers at Tassafaronga fired full salvos of torpedoes and achieved no hits at all. In contrast, Japanese destroyers carried the Type 93, longer, faster, deadlier, and far more reliable. Japanese torpedo crews trained relentlessly in precise salvo timing, adjusting for speed, wind, and target bearing, with calculations honed through years of exercises. American commanders, unaware of the long lance's extreme range, made a fatal assumption during night battles. They closed to what they believed was torpedo range, around 5,000 to 8,000 yards, expecting to deliver the first and decisive strike. But Japanese destroyers were already inside their torpedo envelope, while still far beyond the expected threat distance. This misunderstanding cost the U.S. dearly. Ships that believed they were safe suddenly exploded in towering columns of flame. Commanders misinterpreted these hits, believing they came from submarines or close-range attacks. No one realized that the Japanese had already unleashed deadly spreads long before the Americans ever saw them. Night maneuvering also worked against the U.S. Navy. American cruisers preferred line-ahead formations, a holdover from pre-war doctrine. This made them perfect targets for Japanese torpedo spreads, which were designed to cover entire projected tracks of enemy formations. A single Japanese destroyer could fire a fan of torpedoes that swept across the entire American column. At Savo Island and Tassafaronga, that is exactly what happened. Compounding the problem, U.S. destroyers, tasked with screening the cruisers, were often too far ahead or behind to intercept Japanese attackers. Their lack of reliable radar meant they frequently identified enemy ships only moments before torpedoes were in the water. And even when American cruisers scored hits with gunfire, it did not stop the Japanese from launching. Type 93 torpedoes could be fired even while a ship was under attack, and Japanese destroyer captains were trained to prioritize torpedo release over gunnery. Many of the torpedoes that crippled American cruisers were fired after their launch platforms were already engulfed in flames. The result was a brutal pattern repeated through 1942. American ships fired first with guns, Japanese ships fired first with torpedoes. The Americans could not see the threat, did not understand the threat, and did not know how to maneuver against it. They continued fighting a style of naval warfare that no longer existed, while the Japanese had embraced a modern, long-range, night-focused approach built around the long lance. Until the U.S. Navy uncovered the true nature of the weapon being used against them, they were fighting blind.
For months after the disasters at Savo Island and Tassafaronga, American naval officers struggled to understand how Japanese destroyers were inflicting such disproportionate damage. Reports from the survivors contradicted everything the U.S. Navy believed about torpedo warfare. Men swore that explosions came from impossible angles or from ranges far beyond any known torpedo's reach. Lookouts insisted they never saw wakes. Commanders argued that no destroyer could have maneuvered close enough to launch, yet the ships kept sinking. Something was fundamentally wrong with the assumptions the Navy had built its doctrine upon. The first clues came not from a captured weapon, but from wreck surveys in Ironbottom Sound. Divers examining the remains of USS Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria found torpedo damage patterns consistent with high-speed impacts at long range. The blast holes were larger than expected, with plating folded outward in ways that suggested a warhead far more powerful than the American Mark 15. Naval engineers studying the wreckage noted chemical traces inconsistent with compressed air propulsion, but they did not yet understand what they were seeing. At the time, no one in the U.S. Navy imagined the Japanese had mastered pure oxygen propulsion, a technology the Americans themselves had abandoned decades earlier because it was considered too dangerous for shipboard use. The breakthrough came in early 1943, when fragments of a Japanese torpedo were recovered from a beach in the Solomons after a failed strike. The pieces included fuel tank sections lined with heat-resistant alloys and an injector assembly unlike anything in American torpedoes. Analysts at the Bureau of Ordnance were stunned. The metallurgy alone suggested an oxygen-based system capable of far greater combustion efficiency than compressed air. Tests revealed traces of near-pure oxygen, not the 21% oxygen mix found in atmospheric air. This discovery was explosive, literally and intellectually. A torpedo using pure oxygen would leave almost no visible wake, would burn cleaner, and could deliver vastly more energy to its propulsion system. It could go faster and farther while carrying a heavier warhead. Suddenly, the mysteries of Savo Island in Tassafaronga began to make sense. Naval intelligence compiled the evidence into a classified report that circulated to senior fleet commanders, including Admirals Chester Nimitz and William Halsey. The conclusion was chilling. Japan possessed a torpedo unmatched by anything in the U.S. arsenal. The weapon, now confirmed as the Type 93, had a range exceeding 20,000 yards, traveled at high speed, and carried a 1,080-pound warhead. Worse, it could be launched in massive spreads without revealing the firing ship. Unlike the American Mark 15, which belched bubbles and often revealed its approach, the Type 93 ran silently and invisibly through the black water. The Americans realized they had been fighting a naval war with assumptions 20 years out of date. Even more startling was the discovery that Japanese destroyer crews had trained extensively in long-range torpedo tactics. Documents captured at Guadalcanal detailed complex firing doctrines, salvos aimed not at present positions, but at projected enemy movements, with calculations accounting for course changes, relative speed, and nighttime visibility conditions. The Japanese were not simply lucky in their hits, they were executing a well-rehearsed system. Officers reading the intelligence summaries described the moment as a revelation, even a humiliation. The U.S. Navy had entered the war believing its cruiser-destroyer forces were superior. Now it was clear the Japanese had outclassed them in both technology and doctrine. Additional evidence arrived from the analysis of a damaged but recoverable Type 93 warhead found after the Battle of Kolombangara. The sheer size of the explosive charge stunned ordnance specialists. The Long Lance carried more than twice the explosive content of the American Mark 15, explaining why so many U.S. cruisers had been gutted or crippled by a single hit. The intelligence reports forced a complete reevaluation of surface warfare assumptions. American commanders finally understood that Japanese destroyers did not need to close to suicidal ranges. They could fire from far beyond the reach of American torpedoes, often before U.S. ships even detected their presence. The implications were staggering. It meant every night engagement fought in 1942 had been stacked heavily in Japan's favor, not through chance, but through design. It meant that American cruisers had been unknowingly sailing into torpedo envelopes far larger and deadlier than any previous Navy had ever created. And it meant that unless the U.S. Navy adapted fast, it would continue losing ships to an enemy weapon it could neither see nor counter. The discovery of the Long Lance did not immediately solve the problem, but it finally exposed the truth. The United States had not been fighting ghosts in the night. It had been fighting physics, innovation, and a torpedo decades ahead of its time. And now, at last, the Americans knew what they were up against. Armed at last with the truth about the Long Lance, the United States Navy realized that merely improving gunnery or adding more destroyers would not be enough. The problem was structural. Japanese destroyers could fire from twice, sometimes 3 times the range American commanders believed possible. They could launch without revealing themselves, and they could cripple or sink heavy cruisers with a single hit. To survive, let alone win, U.S. forces needed to rewrite the rules of night combat. The first and most important improvement came in the form of technology, the introduction of SG surface search radar. Unlike the earlier SC and CAMA sets, SG radar operated at S-band frequencies, offering unprecedented resolution. For the first time, American ships could reliably detect surface contacts at night and in poor weather, identifying small destroyers at distances that rivaled Japanese optical spotting. Radar did not just enhance awareness, it shifted the balance of initiative. No longer would Japanese lookouts dictate when the battle began. Now, American destroyers could locate enemy formations before they closed to torpedo range, maneuver preemptively, and open fire with radar-directed gunnery. The second adaptation was tactical, abandoning the outdated line-ahead cruiser formations that made American ships perfect torpedo targets. In their place emerged dispersed formations designed to minimize the destructive potential of Long Lance salvos. Tight clusters of cruisers, once the standard, were broken into flexible groups screened aggressively by radar-equipped destroyers. Task forces now maneuvered with greater spacing, reducing the chance that a single fan of torpedoes could cripple multiple ships. American destroyers were also given a new, more aggressive mission: torpedo interception and early disruptor attacks. Rather than trailing behind the cruisers or remaining on the flanks, they were ordered to push forward into contact, using radar to locate Japanese forces, launch their own torpedoes first, and force Japanese ships to maneuver defensively rather than offensively. This alone reduced the effectiveness of Long Lance salvos because Japanese torpedo doctrine relied on stable target tracks. If the Americans dodged or changed course early enough, the deadly spreads became far less lethal. The third innovation was the development of torpedo dodge maneuvers, something the U.S. Navy had previously considered nearly impossible in night combat. Radar allowed ships to detect when Japanese destroyers turned sharply, an indication they had fired torpedoes. In response, American captains began ordering immediate turnaway maneuvers, altering course 20 to 30 degrees to throw off Japanese solutions. Although risky and often executed under fire, these turns saved countless ships. By forcing Japanese torpedoes to miss their predicted intercept points, the Americans bought themselves precious seconds and sometimes entire battles. Combined with zigzag patterns during approach, the U.S. Navy dramatically reduced its vulnerability to long-range spreads. The fourth major adaptation involved fire control and gunnery doctrine. Radar-directed gunfire, once experimental, became central to night engagements. Ships no longer waited for visual confirmation. Instead, the moment radar plotted a solid contact, American cruisers opened fire with full broadsides, saturating the grid square where Japanese destroyers were likely maneuvering. This aggressive posture directly challenged Japanese plans. Their night doctrine assumed American hesitation. It assumed they would wait for sighting reports. It assumed confusion. Radar cut through that confusion like a knife. Japanese officers, who once held the initiative by observing American silhouettes at long range, now found themselves targeted before they could close within torpedo launch distance. Perhaps the most important tactical breakthrough occurred during the series of battles in the Central Solomons: Kula Gulf, July 1943, Vela Gulf, August 1943, and the Battle of Cape St. George, November 1943. In these engagements, U.S. destroyers under commanders like Frederick Moosbrugger and R. Lee Burke used radar positioning to launch their own torpedoes first. They fired from ambush, then immediately maneuvered clear before the Japanese could respond. At Vela Gulf, American destroyers sank 3 Japanese destroyers without suffering a single hit. It was the first time in the war that Japan's night-fighting destroyer forces suffered a decisive defeat in a torpedo engagement, a symbolic reversal of all that had happened at Savo Island. By late 1943, the Americans had turned a weakness into a strength. Radar gave them eyes in the darkness. New formations reduced their vulnerability. Torpedo dodge doctrine saved ships that would once have been lost. And aggressive destroyer tactics ensured they no longer waited to be struck. They struck first. The Long Lance remained a masterpiece of engineering, but its dominance had been broken. Now the Americans could finally fight the night on equal terms, and soon on superior ones. By late 1943, the story of night combat in the Pacific had changed completely. What had begun with catastrophic losses at Savo Island and Tassafaronga, battles where American cruisers were ripped open by long-lance torpedoes fired from invisible foes, had transformed into a series of U.S. victories where the Japanese never got close enough to unleash their most feared weapon. The shift was not sudden. It was the result of months of painful learning, technological adaptation, and a complete doctrinal overhaul. The American surface fleet did not simply learn how to avoid the Long Lance. They learned how to dismantle the Japanese night fighting system that made the Long Lance deadly in the first place. The turning point came into full view at Cape St. George on November 25, 1943. Under the command of Captain R. Lee Burke, Destroyer Squadron 23 intercepted a group of Japanese destroyers attempting to evacuate troops from Buka Island. But this time, the Americans held every advantage. Their ships carried SG radar, they maneuvered silently at high speed, and their training emphasized instantaneous reaction to radar contacts. Burke's destroyers approached undetected, plotted precise positions on Japanese ships, and launched their own torpedoes first, exactly what the Imperial Navy had done to the Americans in 1942. The results were devastating. The Americans struck without being seen, crippling and sinking 3 Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri, in a series of coordinated attacks. Not a single American ship was hit by a long-lance. Not a single torpedo even came close. For the first time in the war, Japanese destroyer captains, men trained to own the night, found themselves blinded, outmaneuvered, and destroyed before they could bring their torpedo tubes to bear. Japan's most feared surface warfare tradition had been broken. Cape St. George was not an anomaly, it was confirmation. The Americans had finally built a system more powerful than Japan's decades of night fighting expertise. Radar-directed gunnery removed the advantage of Japanese optics. Dispersed formations denied Japanese torpedo spreads the clustered targets they needed. Torpedo dodge maneuvers made long-range launches unreliable. Forward destroyer screens prevented enemy ships from slipping close enough to fire effectively. And perhaps most importantly, U.S. captains had learned to trust radar. In 1942, radar was an uncertain tool, used cautiously and often ignored. In 1943, it became the Navy's most lethal weapon, an invisible gun sight that let American ships strike first, strike accurately, and strike without warning. The Japanese, by contrast, were trapped by their own success. For a decade, they had refined a doctrine that assumed visual superiority and the guaranteed surprise of long-lance salvos. They had never developed effective countermeasures against radar. Their ships lacked comparable detection technology. Their training emphasized nighttime stealth, not electronic warfare. And as the months passed, their destroyer forces were worn down by losses that could not be replaced. By 1944, the American mastery of night combat had become so complete that Japanese destroyers avoided decisive engagements altogether. Admirals increasingly forbade long-range torpedo attacks unless conditions were perfect, conditions that no longer existed because American radar negated them. The irony was stark. The United States began the war with the worst-performing torpedo of any major navy and the least effective night-fighting doctrine. Japan had begun with the best torpedo in the world and a night-fighting system unmatched in skill. By 1943-44, those roles had reversed. American destroyers and cruisers now approached night battles with confidence. They knew how to detect Japanese formations long before entering the deadly envelope of the long-lance. They knew how to launch their own attacks from beyond visual range. They knew how to disrupt Japanese firing solutions through maneuver and spacing. And they knew that if the Japanese attempted a torpedo strike, radar-guided gunnery would punish the launch platform before the torpedoes ever reached the water. The long-lance remained a fearsome weapon, but its era of dominance had ended. In the Solomons, in the Bismarck Sea, in the Central Pacific, night after night, the Americans proved that technological adaptation could overcome even the most elegant enemy design. By the time the U.S. Navy advanced toward the Marianas in 1944, Japanese destroyer captains no longer believed the night guaranteed them victory. They feared radar, feared the unseen American approach, feared a torpedo strike delivered by ships they could not see. The ocean that once concealed their attacks now concealed their hunters. And so the arc of the Pacific War bent toward an unmistakable truth. Japan had begun the conflict with the finest torpedo ever built, but America ended it with the finest night-fighting navy the world had ever seen. In the space of a single year, the United States had turned the long-lance from a phantom terror into a solved equation.